In December of 1944, a German soldier in the Ardennes opened an American ration box and found something more frightening than ammunition. Real coffee, 4 cigarettes, chewing gum, sugar, biscuits that were still dry, and a cardboard box coated in wax so it could burn hot enough to boil water in a canteen cup. It looked like food. It was actually a message, because if one American meal could carry coffee and cigarettes across the Atlantic, through a captured beachhead, over broken roads, and into a foxhole in Belgium, then what else could that country move? Fuel, shells, tanks, engines, men. The German soldier did not need an economics lecture to understand the answer. He could count. A full day of K-rations gave one American infantryman 12 cigarettes and at least 1 packet of real soluble coffee. Not a reward, not a luxury issue. Baseline. For a squad of 12 men, that meant 144 cigarettes in a single day, before anyone bought another pack at a post exchange or traded from a supply truck. On the German side, the official cigarette ration was roughly 6 a day when the system could provide it. By late 1944, often it could not. And coffee? Not coffee. A brown substitute made from roasted grain, chicory, rye, barley, sometimes acorns. The soldiers called it muckafuck, false coffee. No caffeine, no comfort. Just heat, bitterness, and the daily reminder that the real thing belonged to the enemy. That is why the little American ration box matters. It was not just a meal. It was the war, miniaturized. One side was trying to fight a world war on substitutes, discipline, and shrinking territory. The other side was shipping comfort items by the millions, not because coffee and cigarettes won battles by themselves, but because the same machine that remembered those small things also remembered everything else. The American Army did not accidentally become the Army of Coffee. That habit was older than the Second World War. Older than Normandy, older than the tank, older than the airplane. It reached back to a very different war, when Union soldiers marched through mud with hardtack in their haversacks and coffee beans riding beside powder and shot. During the American Civil War, a Union soldier was issued 36 pounds of coffee per year. 36 pounds. Green beans, usually unroasted, carried in sacks, ground in camp, boiled in blackened tin cups, swallowed before marches, after marches, and sometimes in the middle of marches, when a man simply could not keep moving without it. Coffee had become part of American identity before the first cannon fired at Fort Sumter. After the British tax on tea, coffee was treated almost as a patriotic replacement. Tea belonged to the old world. Coffee belonged to the new one. And soldiers drank it like proof. Civil War diaries make this impossible to miss. Union soldiers wrote about coffee constantly. They wrote about the smell of it at night, the sound of thousands of beans being crushed, the sight of little fires appearing one after another across a dark field, until a whole army looked like a low constellation. They crushed beans with rifle butts. They used whatever metal, stone, knife handle, or cup edge they had. They boiled coffee so often that it became more than a ration. It became a ritual of survival. There is a reason one of the most famous enlisted memoirs of that war was called Hardtack and Coffee. Not hardtack and glory, not hardtack and victory, hardtack and coffee. Because the men who fought that war understood something official histories often make too clean. Armies do not run only on plans. They run on mornings. They run on habits. They run on the small physical acts that convince a tired man he can stand up again. The Confederacy learned the opposite lesson by deprivation. The Union blockade cut the South off from imported coffee almost from the beginning. Confederate soldiers roasted rye, peanuts, sweet potatoes, chicory, and acorns to imitate the color of coffee. They could not imitate the taste. They could not imitate the caffeine. They could not imitate what real coffee meant. The difference was not abstract. A Union soldier could wake to real coffee. A Confederate soldier could wake to a substitute and call it breakfast, because there was nothing else to call it. That memory did not disappear. In 1832, the United States Army had officially replaced daily liquor rations with coffee. By the time the Second World War arrived, the American soldier's day had been organized around coffee for more than a century. So when the War Department began designing compact field rations for a new global war, the coffee was never a decorative extra. It was part of the architecture. The man tied most closely to that architecture was Ancel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota. In 1941, before the United States had formally entered the war, the Army asked him to help design a meal a soldier could carry during assault operations. It had to be compact. It had to survive heat, cold, rain, mud, surf, and storage. It had to fit into pockets. It had to be light enough to move in bulk and simple enough to eat under fire. Keys went to a grocery store in Minneapolis and bought ordinary things: hard biscuits, dry sausage, chocolate, candy. The first tests were not glorious. Soldiers did not praise it. They called it edible. They called it better than nothing. In the military, that was close enough to applause. The ration became the K-ration: breakfast, dinner, supper. 3 wax-coated boxes per day, each one small, stackable, and designed for a logistics system that had to move through oceans before it ever reached a rifleman. The wax coating mattered. It kept rain out. It kept snow out. It kept the contents dry in conditions where everything else became damp, rusted, frozen, or ruined. But the men discovered its second use almost immediately. The box burned. Not like ordinary cardboard. It burned slowly, cleanly, hot enough to heat water in a canteen cup. So the ration became its own stove. A soldier could open the box, remove the food, rip the waxed cardboard into strips, set it on fire, balance a cup above the flame, and make coffee in a place where no kitchen existed. That detail is easy to miss, but it is the kind of detail soldiers remember forever. The Army had designed a ration. The men turned it into a ritual. Open the box, eat fast, save the coffee, burn the box. Warm your hands, drink something real. The breakfast unit carried instant coffee, sugar, gum, biscuits, and a small can of meat or eggs. The other units carried their own accessory packets. Cigarettes appeared in 4-packs, commercial brands: Chesterfield, Camel, Philip Morris, Old Gold, Lucky Strike when it appeared. Real tobacco in branded paper, sealed and dry, given to an infantryman as part of the day's expected supply. Think about that from the German side. A man in a winter coat, patched more than once, carrying a rifle through the Ardennes, finds an American box half buried in snow. He tears it open. Inside is not just food. It is industrial confidence. A private soldier has commercial cigarettes, a packet of coffee made from real beans, chewing gum, candy, a box that can become kindling, a system that has thought about the few minutes after the shelling stops. That is not softness. That is power in its most insulting form, because it says without a speech that the lowest-ranking man in the American line is being supplied with items the German soldier now treats as treasure. The American Army understood this so clearly that its own logistics assessments treated cigarettes almost like a fighting item. The official language was careful, but the meaning was blunt. Cigarettes were difficult to supply, hard to justify beside ammunition and food, but close to them in importance. Near them. Near ammunition. That sounds absurd only if you imagine armies as machines made of steel. The Army had learned, across generations, that armies are made of men first. Men who get cold. Men who get bored. Men who panic. Men who wait. Men who need something to do with their hands after artillery tears the night apart. A cigarette gave a soldier a minute. Coffee gave him a morning. Together, they gave him the feeling that somebody far behind the line had not forgotten he was human. That feeling had a price. The United States paid it. During the war, American soldiers consumed an average of about 32.5 pounds of coffee per person per year. American civilians, under rationing, consumed far less. In November of 1942, the War Production Board took control of coffee imports and placed civilians on coffee rationing, a pound every 5 weeks for eligible adults. The home front accepted less, so the Army could carry more. And the Army carried it everywhere, across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, into training camps, onto troop ships, through field kitchens, into K-rations and C-rations, into the hands of men who might be standing in mud, coral sand, jungle heat, or Belgian snow. The cigarette numbers were even harder to comprehend. In 1943 alone, American factories produced more than 200 billion cigarettes, and a massive share of that production went to servicemen. Over the course of the war, hundreds of billions of cigarettes moved through military channels, ration packs, post exchanges, morale shipments, and supply depots. The tobacco companies wrapped the habit in patriotism. Buy cigarettes for the boys. Send a carton overseas. Lucky Strike changed its green pack to white and claimed green had gone to war. The slogan was brilliant. The claim was less pure than the advertisement suggested, but the cultural result was real. By 1944, cigarettes were everywhere Americans were. In ration boxes, in jacket pockets, in helmets, in supply trucks, in trade, in jokes, in grief, in silence. Now cross the line. Germany entered the war as a land power with brilliant tactics and a dangerous appetite for territory. It did not enter as a country that could feed and comfort millions of men indefinitely against the world's largest industrial economies. From 1939 onward, Allied blockade and wartime disruptions strangled overseas imports. Real coffee disappeared into memory, privilege, and black market trade. German troops drank substitute coffee because the continent could grow barley and rye, but it could not grow Brazilian coffee beans. Ersatz became the word of the age. Substitute rubber, substitute fuel, substitute fats, substitute coffee. The word did not simply mean replacement. By 1944, it meant disappointment with a label. The German soldiers' tobacco situation was no better. The regime had an ideological problem with smoking. Hitler personally hated it. Nazi public health campaigns attacked it. Smoking was restricted in public spaces. Advertising was limited, and anti-tobacco propaganda was pushed hard, even while the army contained millions of men who smoked constantly. That contradiction mattered. The state demanded endurance from soldiers while restricting one of the only small comforts most of them actually wanted. Officially, a German soldier might be allocated roughly 6 cigarettes a day. Additional purchases were capped. Supply from Turkey and other sources became more difficult as the war turned against Germany. By the last winter, the ration was less a promise than a memory of how the paperwork wished the war still worked. The American had 12 cigarettes in field rations alone. The German hoped the official 6 existed. The American made real coffee from a packet. The German drank grain water. The American ration box became a stove. The German logistics system was increasingly unable to deliver even the substitute. This was not a gap. It was a verdict. And the verdict became clearest in the Ardennes. The German offensive in December 1944 was bold, violent, and desperate. Its armor pushed through fog and snow with orders that depended on speed. But speed depended on fuel, and Germany did not have enough of it. The plan assumed captured American gasoline would keep German tanks moving west. That alone tells you how deep the weakness had become. A major offensive was built around stealing the enemy's fuel after the battle had already begun. At Bulge and other points in the opening rush, German units did seize American gasoline, tens of thousands of gallons, enough to keep columns moving for a time. But the soldiers who overran American positions found more than fuel. They found abundance scattered in the snow. K-ration boxes, C-ration cans, chocolate, canned fruit, white bread, cigarette cartons, coffee. Things the Americans had left behind in the chaos of withdrawal because the American system assumed more would come. That assumption may have been the most terrifying thing on the battlefield. The Germans could not imagine leaving such items behind casually. To them, it was wealth. To the Americans, it was supply loss. Irritating, wasteful, but replaceable. That difference cuts deeper than any morale poster. A German soldier picking through an abandoned American foxhole was not merely looting food. He was reading the enemy's balance sheet. He was learning that the army he had been told was soft could afford to be wasteful with luxuries while Germany rationed necessities. Some accounts from the Bulge describe German soldiers eating captured American food too quickly, sometimes making themselves sick because their bodies were no longer used to that richness. White bread hit especially hard. German military bread, Kammersbrot, was dense, dark, and increasingly stretched by the end of the war. American field bakeries, shipped forward through the same logistics web that carried ammunition, could produce soft bread behind the lines. Imagine the image. A German soldier in a frozen Belgian wood holds a slice of white American bread, not from a farmhouse, not stolen from civilians, baked by an army that had brought flour, yeast, ovens, bakers, trucks, and fuel across an ocean. That slice of bread says what propaganda cannot. It says the enemy has depth. The depth had been visible since Normandy. On June 6, 1944, the Allies did not merely land soldiers on beaches. They landed an economy. Within weeks, more than 1 million men were ashore. By the end of June, the beach and temporary harbor operations had delivered vast numbers of vehicles, millions of gallons of fuel, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. Every division at the front consumed hundreds of tons per day. Not once, every day. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical stores, spare parts, radios, uniforms, tires, bridge equipment, typewriter paper, cigarettes, coffee. The battlefield was the last few yards of a supply chain thousands of miles long. A rifleman outside St. Lo could open a packet of cigarettes made in the United States, carried by rail to a port, loaded onto a ship, moved across the Atlantic, unloaded through a damaged or temporary harbor system, transferred to trucks, carried along roads the enemy had recently controlled, and handed out near the front, all for something weighing less than an ounce. That is why the cigarette matters. Not because tobacco is noble, not because smoking was healthy, not because comfort items are the moral center of war. The cigarette matters because if a supply chain can deliver a 4-pack to a foxhole on time, it can deliver artillery fuses, penicillin, gasoline, radio batteries, and replacement bolts. A system that handles the tiny things has already solved problems the desperate army is still pretending willpower can overcome. The American supply machine strained. It failed at times. It wasted material on a scale that enraged its own officers. It was messy, bureaucratic, and frequently unfair. But it kept moving. When the breakout from Normandy outran the railways and ports, the Army improvised one of the most famous supply runs in military history, the Red Ball Express. Beginning in late August 1944, dedicated one-way roads were marked for trucks carrying supplies from Normandy depots toward the advancing armies. Loaded trucks out, empty trucks back. Military police controlled intersections. Civilian traffic was pushed aside. The road itself became a conveyor belt. At its peak, thousands of trucks ran day and night. Many were 2.5-ton GMC cargo trucks, driven in exhausting shifts, often faster than the rule book allowed, in blackout conditions, over roads damaged by bombing and heavy use. The Red Ball Express ran for 83 days. It delivered more than 400,000 tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, medical equipment, replacement parts, and yes, K-rations, coffee, cigarettes. The drivers ate behind the wheel. They slept in the cab when they could. They fixed trucks on the roadside or abandoned them if they had to. The round trip could swallow more than 2 days of a man's life, and then demand he do it again. A large majority of those drivers were African American soldiers serving in a segregated army that still denied them full equality while depending on them to keep the front alive. That contradiction belongs in the story. The American system could be materially generous to its soldiers and still morally blind to the men doing some of its hardest labor. But the work they did was decisive. They were not only hauling gasoline, they were hauling the ordinary comforts that told frontline men the rear still existed. They were delivering morale at convoy speed. Germany had nothing comparable. The image of the Wehrmacht as an entirely mechanized force is one of the great distortions of popular memory. The German army used tanks and trucks and armored cars, but its logistics still depended heavily on horses. Millions of horses and mules served the German war effort. They pulled artillery, they hauled wagons, they moved supplies at the speed of animals that needed fodder, rest, and roads that air attack could turn into slaughter zones. By 1944, as Allied aircraft hunted movement in daylight and fuel shortages worsened, the horse was not an old-fashioned decoration. It was a sign of limitation, A dead horse on a muddy road meant more than a dead animal. It meant a wagon stopped. It meant bread did not arrive. It meant ammunition waited behind a blockage. It meant a company up ahead might not receive the little it had been promised. So put the two images beside each other. On one side, a dedicated truck highway guarded by military police, pushing thousands of tons forward every day, including ration boxes with soluble coffee and branded cigarettes. On the other, horse-drawn wagons, substitute coffee, shrinking bread, scarce tobacco, and an offensive plan that required captured enemy gasoline to keep moving. That is not just logistics. That is psychology. Because soldiers are experts in material truth. They know what lies in speeches. They know what cannot be faked. A man can be told the enemy is weak. Then he opens the enemy's ration box. A man can be told victory depends on faith. Then he sees the enemy throw away what his own army cannot issue. A man can be told Germany still has reserves. Then he watches a horse-drawn column freeze in a road rut while American trucks keep appearing from the west. At some point, the mind stops arguing. The body understands. We are not being beaten by bravery. We are being buried by a system. British intelligence heard German officers circle that truth when they thought no one was listening. At Trent Park, a manor house in England, captured senior German officers were held in comfortable conditions. They walked the grounds. They talked in rooms they believed were private. The rooms were wired. German-speaking intelligence staff, many of them refugees from the regime those officers had served, listened and transcribed. The conversations reveal many things: vanity, denial, cruelty, professional rivalry, fear. But they also reveal how deeply Allied material superiority had entered German thinking. The officers did not experience it as a spreadsheet. They experienced it as pressure, unending pressure. Shells when shells should have run low. Aircraft when the weather cleared. Fuel when distance should have exhausted it. Fresh divisions, fresh vehicles, fresh food. The enemy did not simply attack. The enemy replenished. That word matters. Replenished. The German soldier of 1944 often fought inside a system of shrinking circles. Less territory, less fuel, less food, less sleep, less replacement equipment, less faith in orders that no longer matched reality. The American soldier fought inside a system that, however imperfectly, kept widening behind him. More ships, more trucks, more depots, more rations, more replacements, more of the small things that made endurance feel possible. That is why captured American rations became prizes. Coffee was not just coffee. It was proof the enemy had access to a world still open to him. Cigarettes were not just cigarettes. They were portable wealth. After the fighting ended, American cigarettes became a kind of currency in ruined Germany. In prisoner of war camps, cigarettes had already functioned as money, with prices and exchange rates emerging naturally among men who trusted tobacco more than paper. In occupied cities, American packs could buy favors, food, services, and silence. The Reichmark had lost moral and economic authority. A pack of Chesterfields still spoke a language everyone understood. There is something almost brutal in that. A product the American army placed beside breakfast could become money in a defeated country, not because tobacco possessed magic, because trust had migrated. A cigarette was small, divisible, familiar, scarce, and desired. It held value when official promises did not. And every American soldier who received cigarettes by the carton had, in his pocket, a kind of empire the defeated economy could not reproduce. German prisoners brought to the United States felt the contrast even more directly. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to be fed according to the standards of the detaining power. That meant German POWs in American camps often received food that looked astonishing compared to what they had known near the front. Meat, white bread, coffee, cigarettes. Some gained weight. Some were stunned by the scale of American farms, railroads, supermarkets, and ordinary abundance. For men raised on the promise that Germany was building the future, captivity could become a daily lesson in what industrial depth actually looked like, not in a parade, in breakfast. This is where the story becomes more than a comparison of menus. The American ration system reflected a different assumption about the man at the bottom of the army. The United States did not always live up to its own ideals. It humiliated and segregated black soldiers while relying on their labor. It wasted supplies. It made brutal mistakes. It sometimes treated men as numbers. But inside its ration philosophy was a practical belief that mattered. The private was still a person. A cold, dirty, frightened, exhausted person. And if the army wanted that person to keep moving, shooting, digging, loading, driving, and standing watch, it had to feed more than his calorie requirement. It had to feed his will to remain himself. Coffee did that. A cigarette did that. Chewing gum did that. A piece of chocolate did that. None of them replaced training, leadership, firepower, or courage, but they kept the human being attached to the weapon. The German system valued endurance differently. It honored hardness. It demanded sacrifice. It trusted discipline, obedience, ideology, and the myth of will. There was strength in that, for a time. German soldiers often fought with extraordinary skill and tenacity. No honest account of the war should deny that. But skill cannot drink substitute coffee forever and call it morale. Courage cannot fuel a tank. Discipline cannot conjure tobacco, bread, tires, or gasoline from a collapsing economy. Willpower can postpone defeat. It cannot outproduce steel mills. It cannot reopen sea lanes. It cannot make barley become coffee beans. And by the winter of 1944, the gap had become intimate, not national, not theoretical, intimate. It lived in a soldier's mouth. The American tasted coffee. The German tasted roasted grain. The American opened a fresh pack. The German counted what remained. The American complained when rations were late. The German was grateful when substitutes arrived at all. The American left supplies behind and expected replacement. The German captured them and saw evidence. That evidence did not need translation. It sat in the palm of his hand. 4 cigarettes in one meal box. 12 in a day. A packet of coffee. A waxed carton that could boil water. A country that remembered the small needs of a private was revealing something enormous about its capacity. It had enough surplus to care about morale, enough shipping to move luxuries, enough planning to standardize comfort, enough bureaucracy to procure billions of tiny items and still build bombers, tanks, trucks, rifles, landing craft, and liberty ships. The little ration box was a receipt from the American war machine, and Germany, by then, was fighting with an unpaid bill. That does not mean coffee and cigarettes won the Second World War. Wars are not won by single objects. They are won by systems, by production, by shipping, by repair, by training, by intelligence, by command decisions, by alliances, by sacrifices so large they become hard to hold in the mind. But the small objects reveal the system better than the grand ones sometimes do. A tank can be propaganda. A parade can lie. A ration box is harder to fake. It shows what an army can afford to treat as normal. So return to the snow. A German soldier opens a box. He finds the kind of coffee he has not tasted in months. He finds cigarettes packed as if they are ordinary. He finds sugar, gum, biscuits. He sees that even the trash is useful because the waxed cardboard burns. Maybe he laughs. Maybe he swears. Maybe he pockets everything before an officer sees it. But somewhere beneath the hunger and the greed and the relief, there is another thought, a quieter one. This is what they give to privates. Not generals, not heroes, not men on leave. Privates. And if this is what their privates carry, then the war behind them must be larger than anything our leaders promised us we could defeat. That was the real power of American abundance. Not comfort as softness, comfort as evidence. A cup of real coffee in a frozen foxhole was not separate from the artillery barrage. It came from the same docks, the same ships, the same depots, the same trucks, the same planning culture, the same belief that the fighting man had to be sustained before he could be spent. The cigarette was not separate from strategy. It was strategy made personal. A tiny, burning proof that the supply line still reached all the way home. The German army had brave men inside a failing machine. The American army had flawed men inside a machine that could keep feeding them. And in the end, that difference was visible in the smallest possible place. Not on a map, not in a headquarters, not in a speech. In a wax-coated cardboard box lying open in the snow. The box was not a luxury. It was a warning label from a country Germany could not outlast.